And now, without further ado, Mark Sisson, the president of the Board of Trustees of the Unitarian Universalists of Southold.
No. Okay. Hi. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Sisson. As Randy said, welcome to the new home of the Unitarian Universalists of Southold. We are so glad to see all of you here today. We have been happy to host the non-religious North Fork Action Center for over a year. North Fork Action Center meets here on the last Sunday of every month at 4 p.m., and all are welcome to attend. We here at the Unitarian Universalists of Southold like to partner with groups that share our UU values, the pursuit of justice, the worthiness of every individual, and the interconnected web of life on earth. Today, countries around the world have designated May 1st as a national holiday, but we haven't here in the United States yet. With labor rights weakened by corporations shutting down pension programs, the rise of the gig work economy without health or other benefits, and the threat of AI replacing jobs, especially those white-collar jobs that often exist without a union, a day dedicated to the rights of workers would seem to make perfect sense. In the United States, in 1886, the American Federation of Labor called for a general strike across the United States to begin on May 1st, demanding an 8-hour workday at a time when 16-hour shifts were not unusual. An estimated 300,000 workers joined the strike in New York, Milwaukee, Detroit, and elsewhere. On May 3rd, 1886, Chicago police intervened to protect strikebreakers and intimidate strikers during a pro-union demonstration at the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company of Chicago. This led to a call for a peaceful rally May 4th on the city's Haymarket Square, protesting police brutality. The rally turned violent when an unknown person threw a bomb that exploded, and police reacted with gunfire. Contemporary reports say that as many as 8 people were killed and 60 injured in the riot, both civilian and police. This became known as the Haymarket Riot, an event that galvanized support for the labor movement. In 1889, the International Workers' Congress in Paris designated May 1st as a holiday to celebrate working people around the globe, in part to commemorate the events in Chicago. In the United States, that holiday was suppressed because of its socialist origins and fear of worker union strength. President Grover Cleveland and Congress designated the first Monday in September the official U.S. Labor Day to mollify worker and public outrage in the wake of the unrest caused by the Pullman strike of 1894. President Eisenhower declared May 1st Law Day, dedicated to the principles of government under law and the rights granted to citizens with those principles. That's all I have to say, and now, you should have told me, I should have written it down. Abigail Field is going to introduce our next speaker. Oh, and by the way, if you missed any of this or can't understand what I said, it's being recorded and broadcast on YouTube, so you can find it wherever you like. Thank you.
With apologies, I found out I was introducing you 5 minutes ago. So I want everybody to know that you are in for a real treat because Professor Al Alschuler is Professor Al Alschuler is an extraordinary scholar. He's such an extraordinary scholar that when I was a 1L in law school back in 1999, he was already famous, right? I found out about him from my criminal justice professors, and we actually share somebody in common, which was very sweet to discover. I had no idea that North Fork was so lucky to have him move out here. So you can read all of his accolades and stuff about him in this bio, but just understand this is a rock star of a scholar, and you are in for a real treat when he talks. To follow up on the May 1st Workers' Day, I have a confession. We had one speaker fully dedicated and on point to the labor movement, Professor Michael Zweig, who, if you've ever heard him, is a great speaker and would have really done the history proper. He is unable to attend at the last minute. And Professor Altschuler's and my talks aren't really on labor, although I promise I will do a little shout out when I get started, because this is just too big a day not to acknowledge things. So he's going to tell you, his speech is called Money and the American Way, the Constitutional Right to Become an Oligarch, right? So that definitely impacts workers and the rest, because that's how policy gets made these days, but this is a topic on campaign finance. And with that, no further ado, please, Professor.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks to all of you for coming. Don't you have anything better to do? Look at the weather out there. All right, can you hear me? All right, so thanks to Randy Wade and all the others who helped organize this amazing event in virtually no time. It's very exciting. And thanks to Mark for telling us about this workers' holiday. As he mentioned, it was started in the U.S., but it became Law Day. That's why I'm here. When I was in high school in the 1950s, what did we know about the workers' holiday? Well, they celebrated it in the Soviet Union. That was founded on the principles of Marx and Lenin, right? And so on May 1st, there was Nikita Khrushchev and the entire Politburo out there on the tomb of Lenin and Stalin, and there was an enormous parade that went on for hours with goose-stepping soldiers and miles of tanks and rockets and artillery, and it all went by. And the president of the American Bar Association wrote to President Eisenhower and said, well, that's not what we stand for here in the United States. We stand for law. And President Eisenhower wrote the proclamation, and it became Law Day. And my dad, who was a lawyer in Aurora, Illinois, and a member of the Bar Association, got a first day cover with this commemorative stamp that they issued on whatever the first day, Law Day was. Anybody old enough to remember that other than me? All right, that's, so I'm gonna talk about law, and particularly America's strange system of campaign financing. Timothy Mellon is an heir to the Mellon banking fortune, and in the last presidential election, federal law barred him from contributing as much as $7,000 to Donald Trump's campaign. Dustin Moskovitz was a co-founder of Facebook. Federal law barred him from contributing as much as $7,000 to Kamala Harris's campaign. Federal contributions to candidates were capped at $6,600, and the Supreme Court had upheld the federal law limiting campaign contributions 50 years ago in a case called Buckley against Vallejo. But federal law did not prohibit Timothy Mellon from giving $21 million to Priorities USA Action. That's a super PAC whose mission was to support Donald Trump's candidacy. And federal law didn't bar Dustin Moskovitz from giving $38 million to Future Forward USA PAC. That was a PAC supporting Kamala Harris. So let me ask you a question. You know, what's a super PAC? Can anybody tell me what a super PAC is? You've heard of super PACs. You don't know? What? It's a fundraising. But, well, a candidate has an official political campaign, and those are the ones that you can't give more than $7,000 to in an election. But a super PAC isn't part of that campaign. It's a political action committee that doesn't make contributions to candidates, but places its own independent ads supporting candidates and disparaging their opponents. They're prohibited by law from coordinating their campaigns with the candidates' own campaigns. But typically, these groups are headed by people who are very close to the candidate, the former manager of the candidate's last campaign or the treasurer. And when they send solicitation letters, they can say things like, "We are the PAC blessed by Senator Toomey." The candidate can appear at super PAC gatherings and solicit contributions to these groups, as long as she doesn't ask for more than $5,000. Then the PAC manager can step forward and say that $5,000 would be nice, but $50,000 would be better, and $5 million would be excellent. Candidates whose campaigns run out of cash have sometimes been known to rely entirely on the super PACs supporting them to do all of their advertising and mailing. And a newspaper reporter can interview the candidate and say, "What's your campaign strategy?" And the candidate can answer the reporter. The paper can print the report, and the super PAC managers can read the newspaper. That's not coordination. Mellon and Moskowitz were not the only multi-million-dollar contributors to super PACs in 2024. Just before the election, the Brennan Center for Justice reported, in this election, the biggest super PACs supporting the major party nominees for president have together taken in $865 million from donors who each gave $5 million or more. That's more than double the amount at this point in 2020, which was $406 million. This biggest spending category of donors has provided more than 75% of the funding to presidential super PACs in the 2024 election, up from 63% in 2020. Total super PAC spending in all federal elections, not just the presidential election, in 2024 exceeded $4 billion. That was way more than the Republican Party spent, the Democratic Party spent, and all federal candidates spent combined. Okay, so second question, does a system that channels contributions to super PACs affect the content of political campaigns? Does giving money to super PACs rather than candidates raise the quality of political discourse, or lower it, or have no effect one way or the other? What?
Slants it
Slants it how?
with the direction of the giver. The person accepting it knows what he's giving, right?
Yes. Yes, the person and the candidate knows who's giving it. I mean, it's not secret. These super PACs are required to report who gives them money. That's how we know those figures that I just quoted to you. Although if you want to hide it, there's a way to do it. Anybody know how you do that? You don't contribute to a super PAC. I mean, a lot of people, blame the super PACs for this so-called dark money, but they have to report everything. But one of the things they report are contributions that they receive from 401c corporations. That's a charitable group devoted to education. And the IRS says that these groups can participate in political speech and contribute to political campaigns as long as that's not their primary purpose, which is determined by how much they spend. So they can only spend 49% of the money they take in as dark money directly aiding the candidate or the super PAC. All the rest is devoted to education. Their mission is to, promote free enterprise in the American way or something, and they do some general education on those subjects. But I think that this system tilts the process towards negative campaigning. These super PACs they have names that don't mean anything to anybody, like Americans for a Better Tomorrow. You know who named that super PAC? No, it was Stephen Colbert, who ran for president and actually set up a PAC and got money, and then had to figure out what to do with it. And he had a dark money group affiliated with the PAC, and it was Americans for a Better Tomorrow. Tomorrow, shh. All right. So this informal division of labor occurs. The managers of the group sense that their job is to attack an opponent while the candidate takes a higher road. They've been called the attack dogs and provocateurs of modern politics. I think the attack ads they produce contributes to the nation's cynicism about politics, and that cynicism runs especially deep among young people. In the county in Maine where I lived before we moved to Long Island, a George Soros-funded super PAC backed a progressive candidate for district attorney, and she won. The PAC supported progressive candidates all over the United States, and many of them won. George Soros had no reason to support that campaign other than to advance the public good. Hurrah for him. But the tone of the PAC's ads was negative. And these ads made allegations about the incumbent DA in the county that the progressive candidate thought were unfair and refused to endorse. Super PAC spent almost $400,000 on this local race. That was 5 times what the two candidates spent together. The successful candidate said, "You go from thinking you're driving your own car to realizing you got the play wheel. There's this guy. You think you're driving, but there's this guy. You hope he's going to the same place you are, but you're putting this little plastic wheel along the." And she says, "I always will wonder if we could have won under our own steam." The losing candidate didn't share that doubt. He said, "The people didn't pick her. George Soros did." Well, today the limits on contributions to candidates don't restrict what people can give to support favored candidates, but they do require people to channel their funds to groups that tend to be less responsible and more destructive than the candidates themselves. So I got another question. How many senators and representatives, how many legislators voted for this regime? Any ideas?
I'm sorry, in Maine?
No, United States. In Maine, it's a national, I'm describing federal law. How much you can give to candidates and what you channel it to the soup. You can channel millions. Randy, you have an answer. Zero, of course. No sane legislator would vote for this system. No legislator has ever voted for this system. Where did we get it? Supreme Court. Well, close. Close. Can you tell me what Supreme Court decision do you have in mind? Do you have a specific decision in mind? Citizens United. Everybody thinks we owe this to Citizens United. Maybe we do, maybe, but not directly. Citizens United. Supreme Court's never ruled on this question. This was a decision of the U.S. Court of Appeals 2 months after the decision in Citizens United. It was called SpeechNow.org versus the Federal Election Commission. That was the first case to hold all federal limits on contributions to super PACs unconstitutional. That statute that had those contribution limits I talked about once limited contributions to a super PAC or independent expenditure organization to $5,000 per election cycle. But the Speech Now decision said that statute was unconstitutional. And back in 2010, the Justice Department didn't seek Supreme Court review of the Court of Appeals decision. Attorney General Eric Holder explained in a letter to Senator Harry Reid, the Court of Appeals decision will affect only a small subset of federally regulated contributors. small subset of federally regulated contributors. That prediction ranks right up there with that of the stage manager at Grand Ole Opry who told Elvis Presley he better go back to driving a truck because he'll never make it as a singer. The whole, the small subset of federally regulated contributions became the eggplant that ate federal election law. And the thought that the Constitution of the United States requires this system looks pretty strange too, maybe even stranger than the idea that the legislature voted for it. According to the Supreme Court, Congress can prohibit a $7,000 contribution to a candidate because that contribution is corrupting or creates the appearance of corruption. But according to the D.C. Circuit, Congress cannot prohibit a $30 million contribution to a super PAC because that contribution doesn't give rise to any corruption or even any appearance of corruption. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris would be corrupted by $7,000 contributions to their campaigns, but they won't be corrupted by $30 million to their alter ego super PACs. How do we get here? In speech now, the D.C. Circuit didn't say anything in defense of this ruling. It said only that a single sentence in the Citizens United decision compelled its result. Now, okay, you've heard about Citizens United. If it wasn't about unlimited contributions to super PACs, what was it about? What was that case about? Anybody got any? Corporations, yeah, what? Well, yes, free speech. It's about, that's what all of these cases are about, whether you have a free speech right to give. Money is free speech. Corporations are people. Let's talk about those two ideas. I mean, yes, let's talk first about corporations. That's what the issue in Citizens United was all about. There were statutes that limited contributions by corporations, or not contributions, electioneering communications by corporations from their corporate treasuries. And the court held those unconstitutional. There was a group called Citizens United that wanted to distribute a film disparaging Hillary Clinton. An individual or an unincorporated group would have had a First Amendment right to contribute to distribute that film, and the court held that an unincorporated group had a right, an incorporated group had a constitutional right to do it too. Good ruling or bad ruling? Awful. What's the difference whether the group is incorporated or unincorporated? Okay. They have special privileges. That's what a corporation is. I mean, usually somebody who sets up a corporation wants to run a business, and they want the special privileges that will come with a corporate charter. And the most important of those privileges is limited liability. If they were running this business as an individual or an unincorporated group, and the business injured somebody, the person who was injured could get recovery from the personal assets of the individual or everybody in the owners of this unincorporated group. And if they have a corporate charter, well, the recovery is limited to the assets of the corporation. Well, so you're telling me, Abby, that you can get these special privileges if you want to run a business and make a lot of money, and you can't get those privileges if you want to form a group and engage in constitutionally protected speech. I tell you, that's backwards. Why can you give special privileges to people who want to make money while denying them to people who just want to exercise their First Amendment rights? Isn't that topsy-turvy? Isn't that, violation of the equal protection principle? Well, I'm not so greatly offended by the ruling that group can distribute its film about Hillary Clinton. Mitt Romney said, corporations are people, my friends. That's one of the things you see on bumper stickers. Corporations are not people. What if Mitt Romney had said, church congregations are people? Anybody have a problem with that? Baseball teams are people. Unions are people. Nobody has any problem with calling those groups people. Montana's going to vote in November on a proposal that it says will effectively undo Citizens United. Corporations have only the privileges granted them by their state charters. If the ballot measure passes, Montana corporations won't the certificates won't authorize any corporate spending on political campaigns. You subscribe to I subscribe to the Robert Reich Substack. He's all for it. He's sure this will end Citizens United, but it won't. They'll hold that unconstitutional on exactly the grounds I suggested, that you can't discriminate against organizations simply because they want to exercise their right to engage in political speech. It actually wasn't, Citizens United wasn't the first case ever to recognize corporate rights. One that did bring that issue to the surface was Federal Election Commission versus Massachusetts Citizens for Life in 1986. A nonprofit corporation wanted to distribute a letter telling folks which candidates would vote to restrict abortion as much as possible and which supported abortion rights. The Supreme Court said they had a right to distribute that newsletter. Court's opinion was by Justice Brennan, joined by Justice Thurgood Marshall, joined by Justice Antonin Scalia. Unanimous in the court's result. Those were the days, right? And Citizens United was different from Massachusetts Citizens for Life only because Citizens United accepted contributions from profit-making corporations. Well, should that make a difference? The Sierra Club is a non-profit corporation. It's got First Amendment rights, doesn't it? New York Times is a profit-making corporation. Doesn't it have First Amendment rights? We had lots and lots of newspaper cases. They're all corporations, profit-making corporations. Most of them, nobody even thought that, well, they don't have any First Amendment rights because they're corporations. Well, okay, that's one bumper sticker. The other one is speech isn't money. Or money isn't speech. That's the way it goes, right? Does that mean as long as you're restricting money, the First Amendment doesn't apply? Should it mean that? Is a bus speech? Who thinks money isn't speech? Only one person would agrees with it, would put that bumper sticker on her car. Can you prohibit the New York Times from spending money? Say the last part more.
It reflects the commitment to money as speech. It makes it hard to regulate the actual dollar amounts because the idea is it's okay for rich people or rich businesses to have a much louder voice. And I do not think it is okay to skew political discussion based on how rich you are.
Okay.
And I think it's even worse if you get to skew discussion based on how rich the business is.
I agree with all that, but does that mean that as long as it's money, the First Amendment doesn't apply? Isn't that the only way you can how are you going to run a political campaign without any money? How are you going to get your message out without being able to print a leaflet or buy a TV ad? I mean, we used to have some public, you can have public funding of campaigns, is that, but, yeah,
Matching funds, like they do in New York, where
right,
every
you can do that.
small amount of money given, a candidate gets 5 times that.
Right, that's probably the best way to do it. We used to have that checkbox at the top of your income tax return, you could give $1 to the president. Last candidate who took that was John McCain. Barack Obama didn't take it. And there were restrictions on how much you could spend if you did take. Barack way outspent John McCain, and no candidate has limited himself to the public funding since. But yes, that's that. But as long as you don't have public funding, don't you need money to run a campaign, just as you need money to run a newspaper and send a telegram and, yeah.
How is it so different when you had broadcast TV that would, always say you had to have 2 sides and, what was it so different, like 20 years ago?
What's the question?
Why was it so different 40 years ago when broadcast TV could, require rebuttals from the different side?
Well, 40 years ago, we were still limiting contributions to independent expenditure groups. Speech Now is decided in 2010. Citizens United is decided in 2010. All of this multi-million-dollar stuff happens thereafter, and you can see the charts. It's just been going up and up every election.
So limited, what do you have to do?
Well, at this point, if you can't get the courts to act, you got to get a constitutional amendment, because it's a constitutional right to give as much as you want to the super PAC of your choice. Inspiring, right? Aren't you inspired by that? The landmark of liberty, right? Right up there with, the rich and the poor have an equal right to sleep under bridges, right? It's heartwarming. Okay. Well, how did we get here? How did we? I mean, let's wind up this discussion about why is money not spent on campaigns just the same as speech? I said a bus isn't speech. A bus isn't speech, but you couldn't prohibit use of a bus to go to a political rally, could you? That would violate the First Amendment. You got to protect more than speech to have the First Amendment mean anything. Buses and at least some small private financing of political campaigns if you don't have public financing. Well, but why is speech not just, I mean, that's, some people, the progressives say money is not speech. The people on the Supreme Court say money is just the same as speech. Independent expenditures are entitled to strict scrutiny. Any restriction on spending your own money on speech is the same as restricting your speech, and has to serve a compelling governmental interest and be narrowly tailored to advancing that compelling interest. It's not the same, is it? What's the difference?
People
Yeah.
with more money have more power. What's
Well, that's,
people with $1 billion?
okay, it's unequal. Supreme Court,
Something about justice or equal protection or something like that, where people that have so much money, that they can so influence the policies of the federal government and thereby impacting my life.
okay, leads to unequal influence. There was a time when we were upholding these limits of the federal law that the Supreme Court kind of hinted that might be illegitimate. interest. What bothers me about Citizens United is that after it says, okay, you got a right to distribute this film about Hillary, it prattles on for page after page after page saying perfectly awful things. And one of the things it says is you can't consider that at all. Equalization is, and maybe they have a point. I mean, let's say some rich guy puts a full-page ad in the New York Times talking about how awful Hillary is. He really hates Hillary, and he's got a lot of money. And you come up and say, well, I don't have as much money. Let's not let him have an advantage. I want a free ad in the New York Times. You entitled to that? Are we going to equalize the rich and the poor in community? I mean, the Supreme Court says rich have advantage in communicating about things just as they have an advantage in most of life. And it's not our job to equalize everybody. We're not going to try to make everybody's speech equal.
They're doing that at the vote.
Yeah.
It's not the Supreme Court's job to make that policies. Congress, if it wanted to try.
Well, they're saying they're saying it's not their job to equalize. You know, it's not their job.
They're saying nobody can have that job, which is different than saying it's not their job.
Okay, what they say.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah. We're talking about who has the job of ensuring that we all have equal rights to influence policy. What the Supreme Court says is there still remains one legitimate interest. We've already been talking about it. That can justify campaign finance regulation. That's why that $7,000 limit on contributions to candidates is still okay. And that is to prevent corruption or the appearance of corruption, not to equalize influence on elections. Indeed, Citizens United says access and influence don't count as corruption. There's another case, but I think it's the most recent Supreme Court case. It's about Ted Cruz campaign against the Federal Election Commission. They've been eating away at all these federal regulations. There's a federal regulation that says if a candidate loans money to his own campaign and then the election is over, yes, you can use donations to pay back the candidate, but you can't use more than $250,000 to repay the loan to the candidate. The Supreme Court struck that down, said that was unconstitutional. What has that got to do with speech? The election's over, right? The court says, well, but if you don't let everybody, the contributors, at the point you're making these contributions, the election's over, you're obviously just buying influence. But the court says, no. If you couldn't get more back from contributors than $250,000, you wouldn't lend more than that, and that would affect the amount of political speech, at least in the next campaign. And so this has to be subject to some kind of heightened scrutiny too, and it's unconstitutional. One of the things that the court talked about was the definition of corruption in the statement in Citizens United that it didn't include access and influence. The people who wanted, the government who wanted to uphold the statute said, we've got some empirical studies that show that campaign contributions actually influence votes. They actually change votes in Congress. And the Supreme Court said, that's not relevant. That's not relevant. You can contribute, do something. If you showed it was quid pro quo corruption, by which we mean an arrangement that would count as bribery if we knew about it, if it had been all arranged in advance, well, that would be a legitimate interest. But we don't know whether that influence arose from quote legitimate donor influence or not, or whether it was from quid pro quo corruption. Supreme Court of the United States uses the phrase legitimate donor influence. What would the framers of the Constitution have thought about that? You know, what, these justices on the Supreme Court say they're originalists. You know what that means? They follow the Constitution just as it was written and intended by the people who wrote it and ratified it. You know, Justice Scalia's most prominent champion of this provision. He used to give a speech in which he'd say, you know, we have visitors at the Supreme Court, and I meet the visitors, and there's always some little boy, and I say, what do you know about the Constitution? And he says, well, I know it's a living document. And Scalia says, it's not, it's dead. The Constitution is dead, dead, dead. And that, you know, we don't, its meaning doesn't change from one day to the next. We don't put it in tune with the times. We follow the original intention. But what was the original intention? Well, nobody ran political campaigns in the early days of the Republic. You can find buttons that for George Washington's inauguration, they know how to make what could be campaign buttons. You won't find them saying elect George Washington or elect Thomas Jefferson or elect John Adams or elect Martin Van Buren. You begin to see them in well, maybe the 1828 campaign. You know, I don't know of any buttons, but the second time Andrew Jackson runs for president, he does have a campaign headquarters. How do you know about who the candidate is when he's sitting at home, doesn't campaign? It's not dignified to campaign for office. He's not making speeches. He's still staying home in 1860. Abraham Lincoln traveled the state with Douglas when he was running for the Senate in 1858, but he didn't stay home, and you still don't run for president. Somebody comes to Springfield after the convention and tells you you've been nominated. Well, people know from newspapers. Newspapers are nasty and partisan, and they print lots of stuff, and you find out about the campaigns that way. The first campaign financing statute was passed in the state of New York, I forget the date, 1830 something. And what limits did it put on campaign contribution? Almost total. You couldn't give any money to support a candidate except for printing expenses. That was the only thing that was legal. And there was litigation about that. 1840 whatever, when it's William Henry Harrison and Tippecanoe and Tyler II log cabin campaign running for president. There's a log cabin on North Broadway in the city of New York that is a sort of a Whig hangout. It serves coffee and cider and stuff, and the Whigs sort of hang out there, and the owner of the place isn't making any money, and he says, I'm going to close it. And then some prominent Whig says, keep it open until after the election. We need it for the party, and I'll pay you $1,000 if you keep it open for after the election. Well, the election happens, it sues for the $1,000, and the court says, nope. The agreement was contrary to public policy. You were violating that statute that prohibits spending money on a political campaign. We're against corruption in this state. The governor gives a speech about how this is totally corrupt. That's the original intention. Perfectly clear. And yet somehow we get these decisions. Well, how do we get there? Citizens United was about expenditures, wasn't it? The group wants to spend money to put out this ad about Hillary Clinton. How do we get from that to the rule that you can give as much money as you want to a super PAC. Well, Speech Now seized on one of these statements that the Supreme Court put in the back half of Citizens United, one of these things lawyers call dictum, where the court said that, let's see if I can find the exact quote, "We now conclude that independent expenditures do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption." What? No prior case had said that. It had distinguished expenditures from contributions. Contributions were, expenditures were just treated just like speech. Independent expenditures were just like speech. But corporate donations were not. The court gave about 7 reasons for treating the two things differently. You know, speech by proxy, you just wrote a check. That's not speech. Money is different from pure speech because it does there are 2 ways it persuades. One, it helps you put out ads and persuade people who to vote for. But you know what else it is? It's cash, which is just as good as money. That's what Yogi Berra said. You're giving money to these guys. I mean, it's like you persuade them the same way you persuade them by buying them a free weekend at the Super Bowl. You have no right to take them to the golf course in Scotland in order to influence we have rules against gratuities. That's giving presents to politicians because it creates a conflict of interest. And cash contributions to their campaigns are every bit as corrupting. What the right answer from my perspective is you recognize this dual effect of these contributions. Yes, we need them for their legitimate purposes to help people communicate political speech, but we recognize that they are also corrupting. And so we need to put limits on them. Not likely to be too corrupted by a $7,000 contribution to your campaign. But when it gets to be real money, that's corrupting. Well, so Speech Now made this strange statement in Citizens United, the first branch of a syllogism, a logical syllogism. It wrote, "In light of the Supreme Court's holding that independent expenditures do not corrupt or create the appearance of corruption, contributions to groups that make only independent expenditures also cannot corrupt or create the appearance of corruption." Doesn't matter that we have different standards of review for contributions and independent expenditures. The government has no interest in regulating either one. According to the court, something beats nothing every time. Finding even a smidgen of regulatory interest would have undercut the court's analysis entirely. So the empirical premise of the syllogism looks awfully strange, but is anything wrong with the logic? Isn't it true that if the money going out can't corrupt, then the money coming in can't corrupt either? Of course not. For once, Abby, I agree with you. Think about the indictment of Senator Robert Menendez in 2015. That was his first indictment for bribery. It wasn't the one that sent him to the penitentiary under his current 11-year sentence. The indictment in 2015 alleged that Dr. Salomon Melgen, a Florida ophthalmologist, gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to a super PAC supporting Menendez in return for Menendez advocacy on behalf of the doctor in a Medicare billing dispute. By the way, although both of the defendants beat the rap in 2015 with a hung jury, Melgen later was convicted of Medicaid fraud, sentenced to 17 years in prison, and ordered to pay $53 million in restitution. He was reputed to be the wealthiest practicing doctor in America. But he didn't serve the 17 years. On President Trump's last day of his first term, he commuted his sentence to the time he'd already served. Well, back in 2015, Menendez and Melgen cited Speech Now and said, contributions to super PACs can't corrupt independent expenditure groups. And the court said, you got to be kidding, right? There have been a lot of prosecutions where courts have, I shouldn't say a lot, 4 or 5, where courts have convicted people on the basis of contributions to super PACs. The statute on bribery is pretty clear. Payment to anybody can be a bribe. You can't say, hey, please pay the money to my sister or contribute to my favorite charity or give it to my alter ego super PAC. It's still bribery. No suggestion that the PAC did anything wrong. It spent those dollars the same way it spent all the other dollars. But can't the contribution be corrupting even if the expenditure is not, or even if the super PAC never spends the money? Typically, it is the contributions to super PACs that, rather than the expenditures that corrupt, right? Who do you think has undue influence in America? Who buys influence? You know? Who?
The billionaires.
The billionaire class. Wall Street, the Koch brothers, Sheldon Adelson, Miriam Adelson, George Soros, the 1%, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Elon Musk. He was the biggest contributor to super PACs in 2024, $900 million or something like that. Well, so, and who even knows the names of the super PAC managers who spend all this money? They're not, that's not where the corruption is. Well, I made that argument in a law review article in 2015. I sort of noticed this in 120 pages, Florida law review. I was already retired. I'm a criminal law guy. I don't know anything about the First Amendment, but I thought I'd do something different. So I wrote this, and it wasn't my greatest work, but there was a group called Free Speech for People in Massachusetts, and they said, hey, okay, why don't we litigate this issue that Attorney General Holder refused to appeal in 2010? Why don't we make a Supreme Court rule on whether contributions to super PACs can't be limited? So we tried it. I wrote another article. That the first article wasn't very good. We needed to have a better statement, a full statement of the academic position, and so I thought I should get some people who actually know something to co-author this article with me. And so I called my old college debate partner and law school roommate, who is now a university professor at the Harvard Law School and author of the leading constitutional law treatise. His name was Lawrence Tribe, and I got him to co-author it, and Norman Eisen, who had been the ethics czar in the Obama White House, and Richard Painter, who'd been the ethics czar in the George W. Bush. And we got it down to 60 pages in the Fordham Law Review. And then we start litigating in this case with the Free Speech for People lawyers. First, we have to find plaintiffs, people who can bring the lawsuit. It's very hard to do, actually. Super PAC one super PAC challenges restrictions and it loses, the next super PAC can say, well, overrule that bad decision. Let's hold them all unconstitutional. And they can keep trying until they win. And then when they win and, and people stop enforcing the limits, how do you get them back? Who has standing to say that we want you to overrule that ruling and bring these statutes back to life? Well, it turns out the only people who can get past standing and mootness and that and so forth are people who've been elected to office or were candidates for office, were opposed by super PACs, plan to run again, and expect to be opposed by super PACs again. We found them. I mean, the lead plaintiffs was Congressman Ted Lieu of California. Jeff Merkley, the senator from Oregon, joined the suit. Zephyr Teachout, a losing candidate in New York. We had to get some Republicans. We finally found some losing Republicans who were willing to join us. And Congressman Walter Jones, an extremely conservative congressman from North Carolina. The free speech for people wanted to have a big press conference in the Capitol, and so we did. And I was able to talk to Congressman Jones for quite a while, and he said, you know, he says, I don't agree with you guys about much, but I've been in Congress for a long time, and I've seen just how rotten things are. Well, so we then had a strategic decision to make. We have to go to the Federal Election Commission to bring this complaint about failing to enforce the limits on contributions to super PACs. They're not bound by speech now. They're a national agency. They don't have to yield to what one court of appeals says or even 5 court of appeals. But they've already indicated that they're going to follow the Speech Now ruling. So should we say just, you know, rule against us and let us go on to the next stage? Well, some lawyers said, well, we might be able to get one dissenting opinion. And it would be good to have a dissenting opinion. So we took a year fiddling around, trying to get a ruling out of the Federal Election Commission. Had to go to the district court to complain about their failure to rule on our complaint. And as that case was pending in the federal district court, they ruled against us, no dissent. No dissent. So we went to the federal district court to challenge the ruling against us. Well, that district court is in the District of Columbia. That judge is bound by the Speech Now ruling, but he gives us a very favorable opinion. He says, I'm going to rule against you, but pretty much says we ought to win. Then we go up to the D.C. Circuit, which decided the Speech Now decision, and we're not going to win there. They rule against us. So at last, we're ready to go to the Supreme Court and challenge this ruling. You don't want to go to the Supreme Court with weak lawyers like me. You want to find an old Supreme Court hand. Larry Tribe had argued a lot of cases, but he was as old as I was. He didn't want to do it. So we signed up Jeff Fisher, who had argued 50 cases in the Supreme Court, won an incredible number of them, just an unbelievably great lawyer. And he runs the Supreme Court Clinic at the Stanford Law School. We spent a semester with him and his students at his seminar. We attended the seminars by Zoom. We did drafts back and forth. Got an incredibly good petition to the Supreme Court. Much better than any of us could have written without Jeff Fisher's leadership. But I did disagree with him about one issue, and I wonder what you would have thought about this. I suggest maybe we should talk to some newspaper reporters and get some publicity about this case. You know, talk on background. You don't want to, and have them say, you know, a lot of lawyers are watching this case with great interest because they want to know what position the Trump administration is going to take on this case. You remember how Donald Trump ran for office in 2016? What?
He wanted to drain the swamp.
Yeah, wasn't that his winning issue? Drain the swamp? There are only two issues that unite our highly divided society. We're all against terrorism, and we're all against government corruption. And we all want campaign finance reform. And remember how Trump ran for office? I'm self-funding my campaign. I'm not getting millions of dollars from all these special interests and lobbyists and donors that once they get it, they literally do what politicians want. That's not going to happen. These super PACs are a disaster, by the way, folks, very corrupt. There is total control of the candidates. I know it better than anybody that probably ever lived. I wish good luck to all of the Republican candidates that traveled to California to beg for money, et cetera, from the Koch brothers. Puppets? Sheldon Adelson is going to give big dollars to Rubio because he feels he can mold him into his perfect little puppet. I agree. Last debate of the 2016 campaign, Trump turns to the candidate he calls Crooked Hillary and says, I sat there watching ad after ad, false ad, all paid for by your friends on Wall Street that gave you so much money because they know you're going to protect them. Right? We could say this is a kind of important place, and maybe some reporter could even go into the White House and ask the press secretary at the Daily Briefing, Congressman Lewis filed a petition in the Supreme Court asking the court to overrule the lower court that said you have a constitutional right to give $30 million to a super PAC. Does the president have anything to say about that? And maybe if anybody was embarrassed about this, we could write to the Trump-appointed Solicitor General, who's going to represent the United States in the Supreme Court, and say, well, we know you're going to say this is an inappropriate vehicle for even raising the constitutional issue, and maybe we could just sort of agree to focus our argument on that and save the merits until the court takes the case, if it does take the case. Well, I'm a rough guy from Chicago. Jeff Fisher is a gentleman, right? He was not going to practice law this way. So we didn't do that. And case ended the way most cases ended. 2 words, certiorari denied. End of the case, end of 4 years of effort. Our timing was really bad, really bad. If we'd been a few months earlier, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have been there. Instead, Amy Coney Barrett was there. If we'd been a few months later, the Solicitor General would have been the one appointed by Joe Biden, not the one appointed by Donald Trump. And that Solicitor General might actually have supported our position. So, if the Solicitor General supported our position, I don't know. I mean, it would have certainly changed the posture of the case. I mean,
Essentially, if I may, and I'm sorry I'm not following actually everything, this would have overturned, or this would have clarified or overturned Citizens United.
It would have overturned speech. It would have. Our argument was that that Citizens United did not, in fact, dictate speech. This was still a case about campaign contributions. It was not a case about independent expenditures. So Citizens United was about independent expenditures.
So even if Joe Biden, Solicitor General, had argued with you and didn't fight it or whatever, do you think that would have made a difference? Because fundamentally, do you think the Supreme Court agrees with the fact that this is all happening?
I don't know. I mean, when we first decided this was worth doing, we talked about, at that point, we had 4 Democratic appointees on the Supreme Court. We needed to get 1. A lot of people thought it would be Kavanaugh. I didn't have any hope that, I had written an op-ed in the Washington Post when Kavanaugh was nominated, saying the judge who invented the super PAC, because he'd written an opinion that, but there were lots of statements from, surprisingly, Chief Justice Roberts, joined by Justice Alito, sort of saying that even independent expenditures could corrupt, disagreeing with this sort of offhand statement, completely inconsistent with this offhand statement in Citizens United. So we kind of thought we had a chance with Roberts and maybe even Alito. But I think it was clear that the votes were not there, really. And so that was the end of it until another guy at Harvard, Larry Lessig, has written lots of books on government corruption that are really very good in campaign financing. And he had a different idea. While we were doing all this litigation about speech now, he was litigating up in Alaska, saying that Alaska should bring its limitation on super PACs back to life. And his argument was this was so inconsistent with originalism. This definition of corruption as only quid pro quo corruption, meaning bribery, is just so far from the framers' concept of corruption. He says, all we have to do is tell the Supreme Court that and they'll straighten out. Well, none of us thought that would work. Well, so after we lose, Lessig and his group called Equal Citizens decide that maybe we should bring the issue back. And the way, how are we going to do that? Well, I was living in Maine at the time, and Maine is in the First Circuit. The First Circuit is one of these courts that hasn't yet ruled on the issue. If the DC Circuit says unlimited contributions to super PACs and the First Circuit says there are limits, the Supreme Court's going to have to take the case. And how do we bring it up? Well, we'll pass a state referendum limiting contributions to super PACs in state elections to $5,000. I don't think this is a good idea. I mean, because there's nothing changed. The Supreme Court, we can get by. First Circuit is the only circuit that still has a majority of judges appointed by Democrats. Small court, I think 3 appointed by Obama, 3 appointed by Biden, and 1 appointed by Trump. Might get a win there, but then we have to go to the Supreme Court and nothing's changed. Well, so the other lawyers I'm talking to say, is that worse than it is now? Well, the only way it's worse than it is now is if someday the Supreme Court might be more favorable to the argument. So anyway, they're late filing their petition so that they can circulate petitions for the referendum. I have to run down to the Secretary of State's office to be one of the 4 people who lets them petition to put this referendum on the ballot, limit contributions of $5,000, passes 75% in favor. Talk about, people, is there no appearance of corruption when 75% of the Maine, that is the largest vote for a referendum ever in the state of Maine. And so, sure enough, a super PAC comes along to challenge it. It's unconstitutional. They win in the district court. It's currently before the First Circuit. Hasn't been argued yet. Equal Citizens has Neil Katyal arguing the case. He's a great lawyer. His published hourly rate is the highest in America, $3,335 or something like that per hour. So we'll see what happens. I don't know why the case hasn't been argued. There is a case before the Supreme Court on striking down another part of the federal statute, and I think the court's indicated that another part of the statute's going to go, limits on how much political parties can direct towards particular candidates. So we'll see what happens. But I think, sir?
What's the name of that case?
It's Dinner Time something Super PAC versus whoever is the guy who runs elections in the state of Maine, right? So, no, it's against the Attorney General of the state of Maine. But anyway, I think Abby's going to give you a complete solution to this problem, which isn't going to have anything to do with the Supreme Court, right? Okay, thank you. Yeah.
You want to do an intermission? We can do an intermission.
Well, no, after Abby's talk, there's a lot of food, so don't slip away and not have all the food drinks.
Okay. I am going to be a little bit more of a speech sort of a person. We'll see. If you have questions, hopefully you'll be at the end, but we'll see. All right, here we go. I wanted to say thank you to the North Fork Action Center and to the Unitarian Church. And I do want to start actually recognizing International Workers' Day because our labor movement speaker had to cancel. So I just want to make a couple of hit points just to acknowledge that reality. The American labor movement in the 20th century got a cabinet-level Department of Labor. They got the National Labor Relations Act, facilitating unionization and more. We got the Fair Labor Standards Act, which ended child labor, created the 40-hour work week, created time and a half for overtime, and gave us a minimum wage. We got the Equal Pay Act, prohibiting pay disparity for the same work based on gender, right? I mean, the labor movement transformed the workplace in the last century. And those were big fights and people died. And it's important to remember that the world we're so used to living in is the product of the workers and the unions. My first union memory where I got really impressed by them was I went to a march in DC. I was 11 years old. It was about getting the US out of El Salvador. My friend and her dad took me down. And when I got there, there were regiments of unions. They were all organized very neatly behind banners. Each local was there, and there were, all kinds of trades. And it was so impressive to see them so organized, because I got to tell you, it is very different statement of political power to have a tidy march where people are marching in the way we would think about that word, march. And you have this very concerted action to send a message rather than the chaotic free-for-alls that are very fun that I often participate in. But it's not nearly as focused a message of we're here because we mean business and we intend to make change. And so that was my first big, that march was 1981, okay? And the union movement had already really taken big hits, mostly because of corruption scandals among union leadership. That was how they fundamentally started undermining union power, as they demonized the unions. And by 81, you'd had significant decline. It's much worse now. 20% of people were unionized in 81. It's like 10% now, right? However, things are getting better. People are starting to organize again, right? Union activists took on Amazon. They've taken on Starbucks. Real fights to organize the workplace are happening all the time, and hopefully the resurgence, I mean, there are so many labor issues these days, from misclassification of workers as independent contractors, on and on and on. There's so much fight for our workers to do. And so since it's International Workers' Day, just really wanted to give that first shout out. Okay. My talk is labor movement adjacent in that it's mostly about mass organizing to make big change that benefits all of us, right? That's fundamentally what the unions were doing and what I was saying. But instead of labor law, I'm going to focus on constitutional amendments that we Americans adopted in the 20th century. My relating of that history is in service of my larger point. Although we need a constitutional amendment to solve our government corruption problem, as you've heard, That's okay. We've done it before, and we can do it again, right? In fact, I believe, and I'm happy to chat about this later, the political opportunity exists this year. Not only do I think there's a campaign finance constitutional amendment opportunity this year, I think there's one to end partisan redistricting, but I'm not going to talk about that much today. I think the time has come that big change can be made. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit on the need to do a campaign finance amendment, not really talking the court decisions the same sort of way. And then I'm going to focus on how we get it done. I'm sure you're aware that our current campaign finance system creates a culture of corruption that wildly distorts our politics. I mean, it's intuitively obvious. Every day there's more proof of government officials using their government jobs to profit. In fact, today's corruption is so spectacularly blatant and over the top, whether it's poly markets or the insider trading or whatever it is you want to look at tomorrow, it's hard to be unaware of it, right? Like, people get it. But as repulsive and frequent as those displays of greed are, the self-enrichment problem is the smaller corruption problem. Public policy is for sale, right? There was an academic study from a Princeton professor and a Northwestern professor that actually proved public policy is for sale. There's a group called Represent Us that has a great webpage about it, and they have short videos, you might want to check it out, but I'm going to give you some big picture highlights so you can understand the problem. They compared public opinion as defined by 1,800 public opinion surveys over a 20-year span to the policies that ended up becoming law. Each survey asked a clean, support, or oppose position about a policy, question about policy. Each survey had income data, so they could say, well, the people in the 10th percentile income, poor people, and the people in the 50th percentile income, middle income, and the people in their proxy for rich, 90th percentile of income, have this opinion, and that opinion on this issue, right? Strong support or strong opposition or whatever it was. They also looked at the positions on those same issues taken by lobby groups, both mass membership ones like the AARP and business or industry ones, whether your National Chamber of Commerce or the oil industry or whatever. They used a list of 35 powerful lobby groups, and for each issue, they added up the groups on the list that were for the policy and subtracted the ones who were against it to come up with sort of the number of this is how strong the lobby support or opposition is to this issue. And they did 3 net numbers, one for all the lobby groups, one for just the mass membership ones, and one for business and industry, right? And so they said, well, how did this impact policy? So they looked at 4 years after the survey question was asked. In those 4 years after that question was asked, because you only ask questions about national surveys if the issue is a big live issue, right? It's a lot of work to do a survey. And so if the policy changed or didn't change in those next 4 years, they thought that was to be significant. So their sophisticated analysis proved what your common sense tells you. Congress enacts what business lobbyists and major campaign contributors want in total disregard to individual opinions. Or, as the professors put it in their academic prose, multivariate analysis indicates that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. Right? Here's the really important bit about that study. It was published in 2014, and its data set was 1981 to 2002. Long before Citizens United, long before Speech Now. The problem, I would argue, comes back to Buckley v. Vallejo and some other stuff as well. But the point is, this is an old and deep problem. We can't just undo Citizens United. I have a slightly more favorable opinion about the efforts than the professor does in Montana, and actually Hawaii has a live statute on that. I'll get to it in a second. But the bottom line is, if our goal in getting rid of corruption is making public policy not be for sale, we got to look way past Citizens United. That's not the only thing that did it. Okay. All right. It's also important to recognize that the corruption problem created by the Supreme Court goes beyond constitutional rulings on campaign finance. The court has also repeatedly decided that anti-corruption statutes criminalize really narrow categories of behavior, which limit prosecutors' ability to hold corrupt politicians accountable. And in each case, they reversed a hard-won conviction, setting somebody free. To the extent that the court reads a statute to prevent prosecuting obvious corruption, Congress can solve it by enacting a new law to prosecute those newly exonerated corrupt acts. Today's Congress is, in my opinion, too corrupt to re-strengthen an anti-corruption law. So each one of these new decisions, the court is simply, protecting more and more corrupt acts. Consider, the court issued a major corruption blessing decision in 1987, but Congress fixed the law in 1988. Back then, Congress was like, no, actually, we do want to prevent people from, the issue in that case was, do you have a right to honest services? Is there this intangible right to have the government behave honestly, sort of in good faith when it does stuff? And there was a lot of cases that said yes, and here you go to jail because, and then the Supreme Court read that statute and said, no. You're just reading stuff there that's not there. There is no right to have your honest services protected. And so in 1988, Congress passed a quick law. There absolutely is this intangible right? And we want to prosecute people for screwing this up. So in a 2023 case, the court freed somebody convicted from honest services fraud. And we had Justice Gorsuch opining that you can't ever convict somebody of honest services fraud as it's written because it doesn't have any content. It's just aspirational language. Honest services. What does that mean? How can we have courts interpret that? Of course, we'd had courts interpret that for a very long time, and it seemed to be just sort of fine. But what's really important about that decision, from my point of view, is that the court, in their oral arguments and in their opinion, was really worried that we would be criminalizing the revolving door, right? Oh my goodness, all of the influence that we like to think of as corrupt, you're my buddy, so do what I want you to do. Not. This is the merits. We're talking about campaign finance. Shouldn't the law say this in order to protect us? No, it should say that for this reason. Like good faith policy debates. That's what lobbying should be about. You want all the stakeholders at the table. If corporations want to participate by hiring lobbyists, more power to them. Have it on the merits. When you hire a lobbyist who's like, oh, we went to school together, he'll do what I want, right? Why is that not a corrupt thing? Well, SCOTUS blog titled its coverage of the 2023 oral argument, "Justices worry that broad reading of federal bribery law could sweep in lobbyists," and quoted Justice Alito specifically saying, can somebody get in trouble because he's a very effective lobbyist because he's a childhood friend and former roommate of an elected official who later worked as the official's campaign manager? Well, yeah, if that's the only reason that you're having influence, you should get in trouble for that. Why are our Supreme Court justices worrying that that might get anyway. So that was a unanimous opinion, though. Justice Kagan was quoted in that same article as being worried, well, and what about the clients? If it's a crime to pay a lobbyist to trade influence based on relationships, aren't the clients paying the lobbyist equally, under criminal law, equally responsible? You can't hire a hitman, right? You can't hire people to commit crimes for you, right? So that was who they were worried about. They were worried about the lobbyists and the lobbyist clients in this specific case of influence peddling. That's what we used to call it, is influence peddling, right? So the actual issue in that case were the jury instructions. The court said, when you convicted this guy named Percoco, that jury instruction was so vague, you didn't say what was bad enough to convict. And it could have allowed arbitrary convictions, right? The government was like, look, maybe the jury instruction wasn't great, but it's harmless error. This was so clearly corruption that this guy did not get sent to jail because the jury instruction was bad. So you tell me, Percoco, with a guy convicted and then freed by the Supreme Court, was a top aide to former Governor Andrew Cuomo, except briefly while he served as Cuomo's campaign manager. While campaign manager, he took 35 grand to get a developer out of a pro-worker requirement the state was imposing to get his development project done. So he goes to the state, says, I want to do this development project. State says, okay, fine, but you got to do this labor peace agreement where you agree you're not going to screw with any union organizing efforts, and they agree that while they union organize, they won't strike or anything. It's called a labor peace agreement. So Percoco gets 35 grand, he makes one phone call to the head of the agency, and lo and behold, the next day there's no need for the labor peace agreement. But hey man, the jury instruction might have gotten them confused. I think that was not a hard reach for the jury. Any case, all of that again was just to say the corruption problem is way bigger than Citizens United, and the corruption problem is also this viewpoint in our Supreme Court that, as he alluded to, that, it's okay to be influence peddling in what we consider the most crass version of influence peddling around, right? That's actually okay. So we have a constitutional crisis. Congress represents the will of the rich and powerful few instead of we the people, as the study documented. The Supreme Court defines our Constitution to prevent us, and the DC Circuit defines the Constitution in a way that prevents us from solving the problem without an amendment. And the court keeps weakening the anti-corruption statutes that exist. So under our Constitution, the solution is an amendment. The simplest process for an amendment is for 2/3 of each chamber of Congress to pass the amendment, and then 3/4 of the states to ratify it, right? 26 of our 27 amendments were adopted that way. The 21st Amendment, the one that repealed prohibition, was actually done by Constitutional Convention of the states, but all the rest were this 2/3, 3/4. In the 20th century, we adopted 12 amendments, including that repeal of prohibition. I'm going to briefly mention the 4 that were not driven by popular movements, and then I'm going to address the 8 that were driven by popular movements in more detail. In 1895, the Supreme Court struck down an income tax law as unconstitutional. Although the court started walking back that decision in later cases, in 1909, Congress proposed Amendment 16, which explicitly says, yes, the federal government can have an income tax, and it was fully ratified by 1913. Right? So it started in 1909, fully ratified in 1913. The next one without a broad popular movement was the 20th Amendment, which dramatically shortened lame duck sessions and made January 20th our inauguration day. These sessions had originally been long because, 1700s, it took a long time to get places, took a long time for information to get places. By the time we're now here in the 1900s, we've got telegraphs, you've got trains, it's not the same world. And in the lame duck sessions, a lot of corrupt activity was happening, because a lame duck is when your replacement has been voted in but hasn't yet taken power. So you still have all the power, but now you're open for, okay, well, I want a job when my Congress term ends. I'll trade my vote for the job you're going to give me, or I'll trade my vote for that cash you're going to give me. So that's why lame ducks are problematic from a corruption standpoint. And that amendment was driven by an anti-corruption member of Congress who had been appalled, and he got it through. The other 2 20th century amendments not driven by popular movements were the 22nd Amendment, limiting the president to 2 terms, and the 25th on presidential succession that you hear all about these days, and you heard all about under Biden because, we now have elderly presidents. Those were less about fundamental power shifts and more about orderly transitions of power, that the 22nd and 25th. So, the other 8 constitutional amendments we adopted in the 20th century all happened because Americans organized to make them happen. As a lifelong activist, I was unaware of this history of mass movements successfully amending our Constitution because I was always told that constitutional amendments were too hard. And I never did the research to disprove that to myself. I think the negativity comes from the failed Equal Rights Amendment effort, right? While I understand the profoundly discouraging nature of the ERA's failure, as a woman in particular, losing one fight in 9 is an 89% success rate. It's not a guarantee of consistent future failure, right? So we've got to let the ERA's failure go, and remember we actually can do this. Because in fact, for most of our history, we amended the Constitution frequently. Sure, we haven't amended it since 1992, which is a 34-year drought, but while not historic, that growing gap's actually really unusual. We ratified the Constitution in 1789, and 2 years later, we got 10 amendments at once, our Bill of Rights, right? Amendment 11 was 4 years later, then Amendment 12 was 9 years later. Then we had our biggest gap, 61 years. After that, it was 3 years, 2 years, 43 years, but 2 at once after 43 years. Then 6 years, 1 year, 13 years, again 2 at once. 18 years, 10 years, 3 years, 3 years, 4 years, and then finally 21 years. So in some of the 16 periods between amendment adoption, only 2 are longer than our current gap of 34 years, right? With that context, so it's time to do it again. And with that context, I'm going to share like a highlights level history of the adoption of amendments 17, 18, 19, 21, 23, 24, 26, and 27. Which were adopted in 1913, 1919, 1920, 1933, 1961, 1964, 1971, and 1992, respectively. The 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, fundamentally restructured power in our Constitution. That amendment is why you and I elect our senators. Before that, senators were picked by state legislatures. And until turns out, having state legislators pick senators is a bad idea, both because deadlocked legislatures kept seats empty. Imagine the Democrats say, we want this senator, and the Republicans say, we want that senator. You have 2 houses at stake, so you had seats just empty, which deprived states of a vote. But also because state legislatures could be easily corrupted, making who became a senator a matter of money and special interest influence. Again, corruption driving amendment interest. Indeed, our National Archives, on their page about the history of the 17th Amendment, describe it in part by noting the part of years and then explaining, special interests or political machines gained control over the state legislature. Progressive reformers dismissed individuals elected by such legislatures as puppets and called the Senate as a millionaires club serving powerful private interests. Remember, this is being said in 1916. Sounds familiar though, right? I mean, old problems. At first, efforts to petition Congress to amend the Constitution for direct election of senators got nowhere. Voters sent a petition to Congress in 1870. States began experimenting to try to figure out how can, the Constitution says what it says, but is there any way we states can figure out a way to directly elect our senators anyway? And the House started adopting resolutions for an amendment. But the Senate was always like, no, we're not going there. We're not changing how we got our jobs. We like it just fine. In 1905, 2 senators were convicted of corruption, and in 1906, the political moment changed. And it changed because William Randolph Hearst, who was a congressman at the time in the House, hired a novelist to publish muckraking journalism-ish in Cosmopolitan magazine, which I guess back then was not about women's clothing. And they did this multi-month series on Senate corruption. And as a result, there was broad public support for moving to direct elections. He really got everybody clued in about the problem. In 1907, Oregon reformers figured out a way to get around the Constitution. They said, we're going to hold a primary for Senate, and we're going to require all of the people we elect to the Oregon legislature to honor the results. So whoever the voters picked in that primary, you, legislature, have to appoint. That was called the Oregon system. Other states came up either adopting that or something similar. Kansas was the one to go second, but by the time the amendment came around, 29 states had figured out their workarounds, right? There were also, states started sending petitions to Congress saying, if you don't adopt this, we're going to hold a convention. We're calling for a convention to adopt it because we're really sick of it. The petitions for a constitutional convention even were seen as necessary because, as the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court put it at the time, it is too much to expect that the great corporations which control a majority of the Senate will ever voluntarily transfer to the people their profitable and secure hold on supreme power. Same problems. So the House passed a draft amendment in 1911 they'd been passing them, before, but this time was in this moment where there was much more juice because of the William Randolph Hearst lighting of the fire. And in 1912, there was a new Senate bribery scandal involving Illinois Senator William Lorimer. And so everybody was really hot and bothered. Headlines, right? So final amendment text ended up passing both chambers in 1912, right? That broad public support and that lake-breaking scandal got it done, and the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913. Now, unsurprisingly, given the racism in our government's history, the amendment drafting process of that 17th Amendment had some pretty ugly dimensions. There was a big fight over language as to whether or not when directly electing senators, states would be allowed to discriminate against black people in those elections. It was like a way to try to undo the 15th Amendment's grant of power. Thankfully, the racists lost and a clean amendment was adopted, right? But as we all know, states nonetheless successfully discriminated against black voters until fundamental voting law changes in the 60s, but at least the amendment read clean, right? Which was a huge fight, because if it didn't, then you needed a new amendment to fix it. States are currently starting something similar to this idea of state experimentation to fix the Constitution, and by that I mean the Montana experiment that was mentioned, where they are trying to say that under state law, corporations, they are creatures of state law. They have powers granted to them by state law. And so Montana is not going to grant them the power to make campaign contributions. They can't, if they have the power under these decisions that were discussed, regulate it, but the theory of the reformers is that the rights to do what you can do with your power, if you have the power, are different from the question of whether or not you have the power to begin with. Hawaii said, oh, check out what Montana's doing, and they've passed through both houses a statutory version of this that's currently, as I understand it, in conference committee, so it's not yet at the governor's desk. Who knows if other states will be inspired? Maybe they will be. I don't think, in part because of that corruption study I mentioned and the decisions that Professor Altshuler mentioned, I don't think that these laws, even if they survive all the challenges, fix the problem. They would be helpful. I think if they survive challenge, are worth doing. But just like the efforts of the Oregon legislature and the other ones that copied it, the fact that states are doing it and passing laws helps create the demand that you can use for a constitutional amendment. So to me, it's all helpful, even if those are not, even if they are fully legit, they're not solutions, because at the most they undo Citizens United, and as we already know, Citizens United is not the whole shebang by a long shot. Okay. 6 years after enshrining the direct election of senators, Amendment 18 started prohibition. That amendment happened because in 1916, the Prohibition Party and the Anti-Saloon League deliberately and successfully elected a Congress committed to adopting the amendment. The amendment was a campaign issue, and its adoption by Congress was certain once the election was over. Reflecting the power of the popular movement that swept the Prohibition candidates to power, ratification by the states was swift. Sure, the temperance movement stretched decades, and it is possible to to see the amendment's adoption as the culmination of decades of work rather than as a result of a strategic and effective campaign in 1916. But I would argue that all of the decades of pre-1916 temperance organizing was about changing American culture to embrace the concept of prohibition. That was a really heavy lift. You had to create the demand for the amendment, and that took decades. But getting the amendment, once that demand was created, was quite swift, and the electoral process straightforward. The ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women, and again at the time, mostly white women, the right to vote, was ratified after Prohibition, just the year after, and it reflected a Prohibition-style path. The suffragette movement was a multi-decade effort of many players and many tactics that fundamentally changed our culture. But the disparate parts of that movement, with all their different tactics, by 1916 had settled on a constitutional amendment. And a few congressional candidates in 1916 ran on women's suffrage. And in 1916, Montana sent a woman to the House of Representatives. Congresswoman Jeannette Rankin completely shifted the dynamics in the House, because once you elect somebody who this is their issue, they are in place to drive that agenda internally. By 1918, more candidates for Congress ran on women's suffrage, and it was sent to the states in 1919, and we had it in 1920, right? So right now, virtually every American understands our federal government is corrupt and needs fixing. We don't need a mass movement to change everybody's consciousness, as we heard Maine voters 75% or something. Yes, let's fix the problem. So we don't need a temperance movement. We don't need a suffragist movement to get that piece done. This moment is analogous to the 1916 stage of Prohibition and women's suffrage, when the consensus exists, and it's a matter of making the candidates commit. Amendment 23, which was adopted in 1960, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one. Prohibition ended with the adoption of the 21st Amendment in 1933. That amendment reflected widespread popular backlash. Prohibition did not go over that well, despite the mass movement that got it there, in part because there was obvious corruption around Prohibition, actually. Again, corruption is this sort of unifying theme. When the states in their constitutional convention adopted the amendment to repeal Prohibition, it interestingly explicitly gives states the right to really regulate alcohol, including prohibiting it totally. Our Commerce Clause might otherwise stomp all over anything states wanted to do on alcohol, and that amendment, in its grant of power in this way, reflects how effective the temperance movement was, right? So the repeal of Prohibition wasn't actually a repeal of the whole movement's impact. Amendment 23, which was adopted in '61, gave DC residents the right to vote for president and vice president and to have the same representation in Congress as the smallest state. That idea had been kicked around for years, but a grassroots movement really began in DC in 1956, and Congress sent it to the states in 1960, and it was ratified in '61. So again, once the idea had the political organizing, had the political demand, it got done. It's not enough for it just to be sort of a good idea that's kicking around out there. The 24th Amendment, which was ratified 3 years later, was a much bigger reallocation of power. This is another one of the sort of foundational ones. It ended poll taxes. Poll taxes are a really potent strategy for disempowering poor people, and since 1889, were particularly targeted at black people, poor black people. If you don't know what a poll tax it is, it's literally pay up or you can't vote. Pay money or you can't vote. So behaving like the reactionary, property-protecting institution it was designed to be, in my opinion, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of poll taxes twice, right? It's fine to charge people money to be able to vote. Well, Congress debated a constitutional amendment to end poll taxes for years. But, then we had this thing called the Civil Rights Movement. And in 1962, under pressure from that civil rights movement, President Kennedy put eliminating poll taxes and ending literacy tests in his State of the Union. At the time, the only states that still imposed poll taxes were Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia. At Kennedy's urging, Congress sent the poll tax amendments to the states that year. But again, just like with the 17th Amendment about fundamental power and the senators, there was nasty amendment language debates on this one. And the only way it got through was by saying, federal elections, no poll taxes. You states, in your own elections, you want to still do poll taxes, you can do that just fine. But federal elections, no poll taxes. Even after the amendment was ratified, and obviously that whole thing doesn't happen without the civil rights movement, right? I mean, the civil rights movement got that to Kennedy, got that through the Congress. Even after the amendment was ratified in '64, Virginia tried to impose a poll tax anyway for federal elections. And what they said is, if you don't want to pay a poll tax, then 6 months before each election, you got to file a certificate of residence that's been notarized or witnessed. And if you don't file that certificate 6 months before each election, pay up. And then you can vote. The Supreme Court struck that down as a violation of the poll tax constitutional amendment. And then it struck down state and local poll taxes under the Equal Protection Clause in 1966. So the deal that got it through didn't protect the states that still wanted to target poor people. But Virginia's actions are a reminder that the powerful never cede power willingly or easily. And the elimination of state and local poll taxes reminds us that each new amendment interacts with the prior ones in ways that can expand or theoretically contract their reach. The 26th Amendment was ratified 7 years later, in 1971, and that gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. Prior to that amendment, you had to be 21 to vote. The driver for this amendment was the fact that 18-year-olds could be drafted and die, but couldn't vote. It first became a thing when Roosevelt lowered the draft age to 18, but the war ended before it really took off. Eisenhower tried to bring it back in his State of the Union, but the effort died out, right? But the Vietnam War brought it back with a vengeance. You had both the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement demanding the vote. If you were old enough to die, you were old enough to vote, right? They made the issue so hot that candidate Nixon campaigned on it in 1968. Elect me and I'll lower the voting age. And in fact, in April 1970, Congress passed a law making 18 the voting age for state and federal elections. They also, in that same law, finally forbid literacy tests at the polls and finally forbid states from disqualifying voters in presidential and vice presidential elections based on residency. Because whatever state you live in, right, you have the right to vote for the president and the vice president. It doesn't matter that you just moved into the state really recently on that one. You can restrict how long you have to be in the state to vote for governor up to 30 days, but you can't put a limit on the president, vice president out of a statute. So that got challenged, and the Supreme Court upheld most of it. But the Supreme Court said the federal law, not constitution, cannot tell states what their minimum voting age should be. So in the wake of that decision, somebody could be 18 and vote for federal people, but not vote for state people. And Congress was like, yeah, not so great. So they adopted the amendment, sent it to the states, and the states ratified it in record time, just a handful of months. The 27th Amendment, which prohibits members of the House of Representatives from voting themselves a raise by providing that any raise they give themselves doesn't take effect until after the next election, when any of those people in Congress could theoretically have lost their seat, right? That amendment has sort of the weirdest path to adoption of any amendment because it actually dates back to 1789, when it was first sent to the states. But back in 1789, only 6 states ratified it, so it didn't become part of our Bill of Rights like the other ones. It just sort of sat there. Some kid in 1982 was a political science sophomore in Texas, and he had to do a paper on something constitutional. He wrote a paper arguing that because the Constitution didn't set a time limit on ratification, and the text of the amendment didn't either, it was still live. No reason we can't pass this. So he set about passing it. And he started a big letter writing campaign and trying to get states to act and get it through. And sure enough, he talked, Maine and Colorado into it first. And then the other states followed enough, and there it was. We got our last amendment. Again, but because an activist got busy. So to recap, our current political system is corrupt, and we need a constitutional amendment to fix it. But that's okay, because Americans have successfully organized 8 times in the 20th century to adopt amendments, and we can do it again. But, you know, how do you mobilize the masses when we're so divided we can't speak to each other, right? We understand that the elite power structure conquers us when it divides us. It's why a perennial march chant, if any of you have ever been on one, is the people united will never be defeated, right? It's because if they can divide us, they can conquer us, right? But understanding that doesn't mean we know how to talk to each other. And we need to work together if we're going to get an amendment done, right? We have to make allies with people who don't vote like us. It turns out that there's a lot of people who see this as a problem, and there's several organizations offering trainings and structure for how do you go about talking to people who don't vote like you. And one of the members of the North Fork Action Center was bringing to light one of these groups when you were checked in. I'm blocking on the name of it, but they were there, and there's others. And we may end up at the North Fork Action Center having one of these structured conversations, so watch the space. But just a couple of tips if you want to do something more informal. Because this is how I do it. I talk to people who don't vote like me all the time. Find common ground on topics like food or gardens or anything else that's not political that, you know, you have to talk. When you've got respectful conversation going because you're taking turns listening to each other, you can start politics by referencing the bipartisan corruption problem. I guarantee you will have common ground. You can leave it there. Or you could find another topic, maybe there's a little common ground. I bet the Iran war is probably an easy common ground one these days. Not 100% sure, it's pretty new, but I think there's a lot of common ground there. So try to have some of these conversations so that to win this amendment, we really need to ally all across the way. And I'm happy to tell you how I would win an amendment another time. I'm so out of time. You have a question? Go for it. So, well, yeah, people were getting to do food and stuff. They were. Yeah, I'm happy to chat with anybody anytime, right? But I think go eat.
When I get the Zoom link, send it to the school.